Welcome, everyone. This is our third and final session. This, in a certain sense, is the payoff. The first two were, in various ways, setting up today's discussion of anti-Zionism, which, to state the obvious, is something that is affecting us all. Especially since the events of October 7th, we've all witnessed an upsurge of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic sentiment, and those three are all interrelated. They're not all exactly the same thing. What I'll do today is, as we've done, this is a lecture series in Jewish history, so we'll be staying mainly in the historical vein today. But I'm going to start in the present and then end in the present, and hopefully that will tie things together for us. And so let me just start with the thought that the anti-Israel protesting and movement that we are observing is certainly related to anti-Zionism, is certainly informed by anti-Zionism, is interwoven with it, but is not the same thing. And let me just start with anti-Israel, because in a certain sense, it's a little bit simpler. These are all complex subjects, but anti-Zionism, as we'll see, has deeper, more complicated history to it, which is what we're talking about today. But the anti-Israel movement that we're currently facing, I think, is a very good example of this, or rather, it's a good illustration of how we've been approaching this question of, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? That's a question that has been on everyone's mind. There's a long literature on this. I could once again give you a fairly lengthy reading list on that specific question. There are, as you probably know, those who are there are many people who are very critical of Israel, very anti-Israel, who claim we're not being anti-Semitic in the least. We're simply criticizing Israel. We're simply, focused on Israel. This isn't about Jews all together. It's not anti-Semitism. That's one end. The other end are people such as Jonathan Rosenblatt, the head of the ADL, very smart guy and doing very important work, of course, very important organization. But Rosenblatt has come out and said in no uncertain terms that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. End of story. Now, I think those are both mistaken. I think that as I've begun to sketch out, and we'll examine work thoroughly today, I believe that there is a distinction to be drawn. And I will remind you of our initial discussion of anti-Semitism, in which we talked about anti-Semitism being a set of malicious lies built upon some basis of truth. And that applies to this question, in that anti-Israel discourse can be legitimate, rational criticism of Israel in the same way we would criticize any nation or any political system or anything. The anti-Semitic version of it that grows out of it is clearly anti-Semitic. And I'll just give you an example. If your criticism is Israel is doing X and it really shouldn't be doing that, I mean, that, one can disagree with that, one can debate that, but it's a rational argument. If that escalates to Israel has no right to exist and should be dismantled and destroyed, and who cares where its 7 million Jews go, well, that to me is clearly anti-Semitic. So there are the two ends of that spectrum, one legitimate, rational, one irrational, hateful anti-Semitism. There's a lot of gray in between. I don't mean to say that this is a black and white divide, but still the two ends should be fairly clear. And it does demonstrate the way that we've been approaching anti-Semitism, in that it has those two elements. And that's really key to my entire discussion today. So what I'd like to do is take you through a history of anti-Zionism. I'm going to divide it into four phases. The first two will be more toward the rational, legitimate end. The latter two more toward the anti-Semitic end. And as we move through this, I think you'll begin to have a better understanding of what that entails. The first phase takes us back to the very beginning of the Zionist movement. And there is an opposition to that movement that arises almost immediately. opposition to Zionism is essentially the same as anti-Zionism. And that opposition emerges first and foremost within the Jewish community. In other words, Zionism is a new movement in Jewish life, and most Jews in the first, I'm going to say 3 decades, the 1880s, 1890s, and 1910s, prior to World War I, that formative period of Zionism, the majority of the world's Jews will either ignore or more often oppose ardently, oftentimes vehemently, stand in opposition to Zionism. Anti-Zionists today, it should be said, are especially Jewish anti-Zionists, which will be the last piece of today's discussion, are very sure to invoke that history of Jewish anti-Zionism. It helps to inform who they are and what they represent. And it also, in their minds, it gives them a greater sense of legitimacy, as opposed to the delegitimization of saying all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. They would say, no, wait a second. There was a time when most Jews were. And as a historian, I would affirm that. We'll spell that out a little bit more carefully. Let me now remind you of last week's discussion, in which we broke Zionism down into 3 basic principles. Remember, Jews are a nation, a national group. Israel is their homeland, and they ought to be able to live there with some degree of autonomy and self-determination. Right? That's, in a nutshell, that is Zionism. The opposition to Zionism within the Jewish community hit on all 3 of those points. The first large group, especially in the West and especially in the United States, the larger group of late 19th century, early 20th century Jews who were anti-Zionist were Reform Jews. The Reform Jewish movement was, with some few exceptions, was vocally and explicitly anti-Zionist. The clearest illustration of that was in the statement of principles that spelled out what we historians call classical Reform Judaism. It came out in 1885. It was called the Pittsburgh Platform. Who are we as Reform Jews? What is Reform Judaism? Here are our principles. Note the date. 1885 is just 3 years after the advent of the Zionist movement. Not a coincidence. And what is Planck, its most famous plank? It's a fascinating document. I heartily recommend that if you're not familiar with it, that you look at it at some point. But its most famous plank was plank number 5, which states outright, we Jews are no longer a nation. We are a religious community, right? Which is to say that Reform Judaism was a positive response to the promise of emancipation, which, as you'll recall, not so subtly required that Jews essentially adopt that stance, that we Jews are not a nation anymore. We were for a long time, but in the modern world, we are no longer a nation. What it means to be a Jew is to be a member of a religious faith community. That was Reform. That was classical Reform Judaism. And the majority of native-born American Jews in the 19th century, and as opposed to the incoming masses from Eastern Europe, that only begins in that same period in the 1880s. But the majority of Native American, it sounds funny, native-born American Jews were Reform and were committed to that notion that their nationhood was now American and their religion was Jewish, and that's what made them Jews. So that inspired, again, as I always do, that boils it down quite a bit, but that's the essence of the Reform objection to Zionism. It was quite widespread. It will eventually also create a specific institution, mainly led by Reform rabbis, called the American Council for Judaism, which was an expressly anti-Zionist organization and movement. Was somewhat influential through the 20s, 30s. After World War II, after the Holocaust, it dissipates. But in that earlier period, it's quite an important force. That's the first major group of anti-Zionist Jews in that era. The second major group, I've mentioned them in an earlier lecture, and that is the Orthodox Jews of the world, right? So if the Reform Jews were mainly objecting to the Jews are a nation aspect of Zionism, I'm going to frame it as the Orthodox Jews are going to be objecting mainly to the second part, that Israel's their homeland. Well, obviously, from an Orthodox point of view, Israel is the original land of the Jews. But the Zionist idea that we modern people should organize to move there and rebuild there and take it into our own hands, that was anathema to many, if not most, traditional, what we call Orthodox Jews at the turn of the century, for whom the yearning to return was to the land. The yearning to leave exile and return was part of Jewish tradition. It's called Messianism, Jewish Messianism, but it is very clearly, in traditional Jewish terms, something that God will determine. The Messianic age, when Jews will be returned to Zion, will be brought about by God. The idea that ordinary Jews are going to take it, and non-religious Jews for that matter, are going to take it into their own hands to return to the land, that's sinful. That's an abomination. It's anti-God, right? So again, the majority of traditional Orthodox Jews in the 1890s, 1900s, right? It's going to begin to turn eventually. We mentioned Rav Kook, the great rabbinic initiator of religious Zionism. That's in the 1920s, when circumstances have changed. In the earlier period, most traditional Jews are anti-Zionist. And today we know there are some ultra-Orthodox I'll indulge in being a little pejorative. There are some crazy ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Neturei Karta in particular, who preserve and maintain this rabid, extreme form of anti-Zionism, but it has roots. It has a history. And again, the point I'm simply making is that in the early period of Zionism, it was the small minority of Jews. It was the outlier. It was the fringe. The majority of Jews were opposed to it. The third group that was opposed to it is actually something we tend to forget, that as Jews were modernizing throughout the 19th century, relatively few of them took on the new religion of Zionism. That would be in the 20th century. The main new religion for most Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, those who had left traditional Judaism behind, were looking for a new belief system, a new raison d'etre, a new reason to be Jewish and to be in the world. The majority of them found socialism, right? Our grandparents and great-grandparents who came during the mass immigration of the 1880s through the 1920s, the majority of them were not traditional. Some were, but most were not. And of those who were not, many of them had converted to socialism. They read socialist newspapers. They were members of labor unions, and etc. Right? So Jewish socialism is a majority party, especially in Eastern Europe during this period. And from their point of view, the Zionists were the enemy. The Zionists were the nationalists. The Zionists were anti-socialism. They were too particularistic as opposed to the universalism inherent in the socialist revolution, right? So most Jews, whether they were Reform, assimilationists, Orthodox traditionalists, or socialist revolutionaries, right? That's the majority of Jews around the year 1900. All three of them were opposed to Zionism, the third part of Zionism being self-determination. Well, the socialist revolutionary wanted to create an international, a worldwide community that would embody the socialist dream. So the idea of one small group creating yet another nation with yet another set of borders and particularisms was something that did not sit well with many Jews in that early period. So the first phase of anti-Zionism, and here I would affirm the anti-Zionists, the Jewish anti-Zionists today, who say, "Hey, we're not doing anything new." As a historian, I have to agree with that. That's quite true, and it's important for us, if we're concerned about pushing back in some way against the younger generation. Again, I'll come to this a little bit later. It's vitally important that we understand what informs them. What is their worldview? Why they've come to this anti-Zionist position, and much of it is similar, if not identical with those older objections to Zionism, which after World War II were sort of quelled for a time, but have now come back with a vengeance, right? Number two, okay, so that's the first phase. The second, and once again, it should be obvious that everything I've just said, we might disagree with it. You might not like it, but it's not anti-Semitism. It's not hateful. It's not irrational. It's not this sinister, malicious ideology of Jew hatred. Quite the opposite. Okay. Number two is similar, and here I'll move to the Arab world. Arab anti-Zionism also emerges soon after the birth of the Zionist movement and the beginnings of Zionist settlement in the land. And that population of Arabs who were living in the Ottoman territory, sometimes called Palestine, the Ottomans had other names for it as well, they were living in a world in which Arab nationalism had just begun to develop in the late 19th century, around the same time as Jewish nationalism. Many in the Arab world were subject to various forms of Western colonialism. Most importantly, the colonialist ruler of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was Muslim, but was Turkish. It was Turks ruling over Arabs. And many people under Ottoman control, many Arabs under Ottoman control, were developing a sense of Arab identity and the desire for Arab independence from that. And thus we have the beginnings of Arab nationalism in the early 1900s that will focus largely on Palestine. And as more and more Jews are beginning to arrive, those feelings of resisting outsiders, even hostility toward what they saw as an encroachment, as an incursion into what they understood as their land. I mean, those feelings begin to develop. And here I would, let's first contrast that, what I just described very briefly. There's a fascinating history of the early Zionist movement, of the relations between Jews and Arabs in that time. Neither group acts all that well, I should say, but neither group is motivated primarily by racism or anti-Semitism. This is I'll reuse the term I used last time, this is a geopolitical conflict. One of the best historians of this subject, who I'll come to a little bit later. Let me just first say that one reason it's very important to approach this tender subject and this critical time through a historical lens is that in the current moment, it often is the Jewish behavior of the Zionist movement is often vilified with a particular term, and that is the early Zionist movement of settlement, of colonizing, is accused of being a form of settler colonialism. Now, it's understandable why, because Jews were coming from elsewhere and settling. They used the word colonization themselves, so it was a colonial project in a certain way. But settler colonialism is a very pointed accusation. It's an accusation that it is, first of all, a function of Western imperialism, of the colonialist project whereby a Western power conquers and settles some foreign area, subjugates it for its own benefit. That's colonialism, in a sense. Settler colonialism is an even worse case of that, in which a group of settlers from the home country are sent in order to replace the native population and to further that process of subjugation. So it's premised on an idea that we, as white Europeans, have rights that these native people do not have. So it is, and I think this has to be understood, the accusation of settler colonialism is the accusation of it being a racist enterprise. Now, this is problematic when applied to problematic at best, inaccurate even, when applied to the Zionist movement for a number of reasons. One, it wasn't colonialist in the classic sense, and there was no home country. The Zionists were coming on their own accord because they understood themselves to be returning to their homeland, which they were. They were also fleeing from persecution. In other words, they themselves were an oppressed, let's call it colonized people. And so by moving to their homeland, they were trying to undo that subjugation of themselves, right? So they too were colonized people who were returning home. So calling them settler colonialists is just a terrible misnomer. And at some level, it when taken to an extreme, especially the extreme of calling their behavior, its motivation, its effects, its consequences, calling all of that racist is just not the case. The early Zionists screwed up in various ways when it came to the Arab population that they encountered, but their primary motivation was not based on racism. There was some degree of a sense of European and Western superiority. Many of the early Zionist settlers looked at the Arab population in Palestine as lesser, as inferior. One could call that racist, but to me, that wasn't the driving motive. Their assumption was that they were coming home, the native population would learn to live with them, and in fact, would benefit from them bringing with them all the various benefits of Western civilization and modern technology and the like. That was a kind of a rationalization, but still, it's not quite the same as racism, and that's a whole longer story we can go into. If you're not familiar with some of the basic population figures, in the year 1800, long before Zionism gets moving, there are about 270,000 Arabs living in that land, and there were at that time about 6,700 Jews. This is the old Yeshiva before the Zionist settlers arrived. They tended to be traditional. They tended to live in the holy cities of Jerusalem, Tzfat, Tiberias. They were living within a Muslim society and therefore conformed to the norms of that in terms of the subsidiary status of Jews in a Muslim society. When they saw the Zionists coming, they too would be largely opposed, the very least uncomfortable with these newcomers who were bringing new ideas and were upsetting the apple cart. So those are the Jews who were already there, but very quickly in 1890, the Arab population is up to 500,000, and now there are approximately 42 to 43,000 Jews living throughout the land. It's about 8% of the overall population in 1890. That will jump in 1914. From 1904 to 1914 is the second Aliyah, and it's during that period that the Jewish population will double to about 85,000 and now become about 12.8% of the population. So the reason I'm citing these is just to give you a sense of what it must have been like for a growing number of Arabs in that era to feel that they were, once again, being invaded in a certain sense. There's a long memory in Arab culture of the Crusaders who had done terrible things to them back in the Middle Ages, and it's almost a kind of a PTSD for them. Oh, no, here come another group of Europeans. So their objection to that and their resistance to Jewish settlement, again, we wish it had been otherwise. We don't like it. It's really too bad that they didn't welcome them with open arms. But it's not crazy. It's not irrational that they resisted it, that they objected to it. That objection sometimes took the form of violence. Some of the early Jewish settlements would be attacked from time to time. Again, not nice. We don't like it, but this is not yet anti-Semitism. So what I'm trying to sketch out here is that Arab anti-Zionism, which will become quite anti-Semitic, we'll be getting to that in a moment, begins as a historically understandable resistance to outsiders coming into what they understood to be their territory. It's only in the early 20th century, in the years 1905 to 1908, that Arab nationalism will become more specific in Palestine. Historians sometimes call this Palestinism to kind of parallel it to Zionism. It is the origin of a new Palestinian national consciousness, the very identification as a Palestinian Arab, as opposed to an Ottoman Arab or just an Arab or a Muslim or what have you. All the various other identities begin to coalesce and begin to form a new national movement, and that is the Palestinian nationalist movement, which is often said to have arisen in response to Zionism. That's partly true. I mean, there are many other factors as well, but certainly what has to be understood is that the resistance to Zionism becomes baked in, becomes part of Palestinian national consciousness from the very beginning. So that's, let me read to you. There's just to give you a sense of this pre-anti-Semitic Arab anti-Zionism. There was in 1899, I'm reading from Alan Dowdy's History of Israel and Palestine, as he calls it. He quotes an Arab writer in the year 1899. Which is soon after the birth of political Zionism, right? A distinguished member of one of Jerusalem's leading families, Yusuf Dia Pasha al-Khalidi, sent a letter to the chief rabbi of France, who was close to Herzl, challenging the Zionist program. Al-Khalidi began by acknowledging the historic Jewish link. He writes, quote, listen carefully, "Who can challenge the rights of the Jews on Palestine? Good Lord, historically, it is really your country." This is coming from an anti-Zionist quote, right? So early on, not only did Palestinian Arabs know, everyone knew that the Jews had originated in the Holy Land. Everyone acknowledged that connection. No one questioned it. Questioning it, denying it, will come later. And you can already hear that becomes a form of anti-Semitic discourse. He goes on. Then he warned that neither the Muslim nor the Christian worlds would allow this to happen and begged the Zionist movement to find a less problematic locale for its visions. Quote, "It is necessary, therefore, for the peace of the Jews in Turkey that the Zionist movement, in the geographic sense of the word, stops. Good Lord, the world is vast enough. There are still uninhabited countries where one could settle millions of poor Jews who may perhaps become happy there and one day constitute a nation. That would perhaps be the best, the most rational solution to the Jewish question. But in the name of God, let Palestine be left in peace." So I quote this for you to give you a good example of that early form of Arab anti-Zionism, the resistance, the objection to Zionism, which is not yet anti-Semitic. And as I've been suggesting throughout, especially in our lecture on anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is not some pre-existing eternal thing. It comes out of something prior. So in this case, the something prior, the precedent reality, is the resistance of the population of Arabs in the Ottoman province of Palestine, their resistance to this new incoming. And as the Zionist movement will grow, and as the Zionist program becomes better publicized and better, better known in general, that resistance will grow as well. Okay, so that's phase two. I keep looking over at Yehoshaphat Harkabi is a very important Israeli historian that I want to also read from. But let's first begin to flesh out phase three, which is Arab anti-Zionism will become quite anti-Semitic over the course of time. This begins already as early as the 1920s. It's in 1925, for example, that the first Arab translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion will be published. In the lead up to the terrible riots in Hebron in 1929, the anti-Jewish riots, which will kill quite a number of Jews, in a certain sense, it's the first flashpoint of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the lead up to that, certain Palestinian Arab leaders will refer to the protocols as part of their attack, part of their rhetorical attack on the Jews. So they're beginning to use anti-Semitism as part of their arsenal to try to resist the Zionist whatever. Keep in mind that sorry, sometimes that happens. You lose your train of thought. What I said last time about that Arab anti-Semitism will largely be learned from, absorbed from the West. Here's a perfect example, right? It's not that anti-Zionism itself has become anti-Semitic. It's that the anti-Zionists at the time are beginning to adopt Western anti-Semitic motifs and add that to their arsenal, to their set of weapons in their fight against the Zionists. So that's not exactly what we're going to see, the way in which anti-Zionism will itself will devolve over the course of time. That will take place mainly in the post, certainly after the establishment of Israel. During, as you all know, the War of Independence that established Israel is called by the Palestinian Arabs. It's called their terrible catastrophe, their Nakba in Arabic. From their point of view, it was their Holocaust. So it's understandable from a rational point of view why things would become more heated, more vitriolic, more impassioned after the establishment of the state. And that is even more the case after the Six-Day War, when Israel takes control of territories with millions of Palestinian Arabs under their control. So it will be primarily in the 60s, 70s, and thereafter that Arab anti-Zionism becomes vehemently anti-Semitic. And for this, I want to point you to an Israeli historian named Yoshua Harkabi. He was a commander during the War of Independence. He becomes the chief of military intelligence in Israel during the 1950s, and then spends the rest of his career as an academic at Hebrew University, becoming the expert, the acknowledged expert on this subject of Arab anti-Semitism. I'll read to you a couple of excerpts from an article of his. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah in 1965, so it's before the Six-Day War, I published an article in the newspaper Mariv entitled Arab Anti-Semitism. My purpose was to alert the Israeli public's attention to the fact that a large number of anti-Semitic books had been published in the Arab countries. So as an Arab speaker, as a scholar, as a student of the subject, and as an intelligence expert, he begins to pick up on this sharp rise, this spike in anti-Semitic rhetoric in the Arab world. But then he also notes, it is not anti-Semitism which caused the Arab-Israeli conflict, but the conflict which caused this sort of anti-Semitism. And again, I think this is vital to understand. It goes back to the way in which anti-Semitism is historically contingent. It doesn't come out of the blue. It comes out of historical circumstance. And the last quote from Harkabi is, it's not a coincidence that the blatant anti-Semitic resolution, United Nations resolution of 1975 that said Zionism is racism, or Zionism is a form of racist discrimination. That was a UN resolution, right? You, having taken this class with me or attended these lectures, you all know what Zionism is, right? That's what Zionism is, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. The idea that Zionism is racist, is inherently, intrinsically a form of racism. That's a distortion, it's a lie, it's a manipulation of the facts, and therefore, and it's certainly hateful, and therefore it's anti-Semitism. But note the date, 1975, comes just 2 years after the Yom Kippur War and several years after the Six-Day War in 67. That's to say the Arab world tries to destroy Israel, right? After Israel is established, much of the Arab world cannot abide the existence of a Jewish nation in the midst of the Arab world. And there is the abiding, tragically, the abiding desire on the part of many in the Arab world to utterly eradicate, destroy Israel. They try in 67, they try in 73, both times they fail. I want to ask you, is it therefore a coincidence that this most infamous expression of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, the UN resolution, occurs just a few years hence? It's not a coincidence. And it's Harkabi who unlocks this issue. Let me read to you again. First of all, he reminds us again, Arab opposition to the establishment of Israel was understandable, but Meanwhile, Israel exists and has firmly established itself. Um, it is, let's say, they try to justify their demand for Israel's elimination by the claim that its existence is unjust. However, the longer Israel continues to exist, the more difficult it becomes to base the demand for its elimination on reasons relating to the circumstances of its establishment. Its establishment in the past becomes irrelevant to its present existence, as in other instances. For this reason as well, the Arab motivation for demanding that Israel cease to exist has turned to the argument that Israel is negative in its very being and nature. So what Harkabi is suggesting is that this extreme and very ugly form of Arab anti-Semitism, Israel has no right to exist, Zionism is racism, Jews are evil, right? Inherently, in their blood. Those kinds of arguments become, as dangerous as they are, where they come from is a sense of desperation, kind of a last resort. We have no other way to get rid of Israel. We have to attack its very reason for being. Hence, the anti-Israel onslaught turns to anti-Zionism. It turns to the foundational ethos of the state of Israel to attack that at the core, because it can't do anything about Israel in the present. It tries to go back in time to the origins and attack the very nature of the Israeli raison d'etre being Zionism. So I find this very helpful. I mean, it doesn't make the whole phenomenon any less scary or threatening, but it does help us to see the process whereby these extreme forms of anti-Jewish expression, this clearly anti-Semitic, there was a sign outside, they picketed the Nova Festival exhibit in downtown Manhattan the other day, and someone held up a sign that said, "Zionists are not really Jews, nor are they human beings." That kind of extreme, blatantly anti-Semitic language has become very much a part of the contemporary anti-Israel movement. It has been inflamed by events on the ground. You can't leave that out entirely. Again, the anti-Semitism doesn't exist on its own. It always is being fed in some way, being inspired in some way by things, by historical events and circumstances. In this case, it's very clear that the events of October 7th and the subsequent war are fueling this upsurge. But in general, one has to, in my view, keep in mind this dual nature of anti-Semitism if we are going to effectively fight it. And that's where I want to come to in the end. But first, there's phase 4. And phase 4 is now a return to phase 1. There were the Jewish anti-Zionists a century ago. And there are growing numbers today of mainly younger, not all, but it's largely a generational phenomenon. Younger Jews today have begun to gravitate to and adhere to the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist movement. They are, many of them are well-intentioned. They tend to, when they, for example, you say free Palestine from the river to the sea, and we who have a little more understanding hear that as a genocidal call for the destruction of Israel, they would argue, they would say, no, it's not what we mean by that. We mean something more benign. We mean something that's an expression of our passion for social justice. We want human rights and civil rights and political rights for people. That's all we mean, they would say. Now, I think it's important to understand that that is born of stupidity and ignorance, but I don't think that's the best way to confront that kind of language and that kind of stance. I think ultimately it's more important to understand where they're coming from and what has shaped them and what is their general worldview, their Jewish identity and consciousness are all very much a part of that. And that's where I go back to that earlier form of Jewish anti-Zionism. I think it's safe to say that much of, I'm going to make a blanket statement, I'm going to overgeneralize, but it's to make a point. Much of the current youthful, college-aged Jewish anti-Zionism, and there are a number of organizations which embody this. JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now are the two major organizations. Again, neither one of them thinks that it's being anti-Semitic. In fact, I think it was JVP that put out a very lengthy booklet, what in order to try to educate people what anti-Semitism really is, and they stand against it, and and what we're doing is not related to that. But what it is related to, I'd like to suggest, is a major sea change in Jewish consciousness, especially in America. And that is whereas for the older generation, I'll assume everyone online here is of a certain generation. Our generation tended to take for granted that Jews are a people. Here in America, we're an ethnic group. Major pieces of our Jewish concern and our Jewish identity was a relationship to Israel, was a memory and commemoration of the Holocaust, our fellow Jews who perished. Right, there was a sense of connection to other Jews and of this collectivity we call the Jewish people. We all have taken that for granted for a very long time. And it's come as a bit of a shock to many of us, the degree to which that does not speak to this generation. They do not think of the Jews as a people with national rights, with a connection to Israel. They've begun to, that has all begun to dissipate. Part of that is, as the writer Peter Baynard, who is a leading anti-Zionist nowadays, but in 2010 he wrote what I still believe was a very perceptive article in which he accused the organized Jewish community of giving young people a choice. If you want to be, we want you to be Zionist, but in order to be Zionist, you have to check your liberalism at the door. You can't bring that with you. And so what many young people did, according to Baynard, was they checked their Zionism and stuck with the liberalism. So I think there's some truth to that, but I think there's something deeper going on as well, and again, I'm going to oversimplify, but the phenomenon of interfaith marriage, intermarriage, which we're all aware of and familiar with, and I'm sure it's touched many of our own lives as well. This begins in earnest in the 1970s and 80s, when it moves from single-digit percentages and will reach over 50% in certain parts of the country today. That's to say that the phenomenon of Jews marrying out has become a not just widespread, but it's become a majority phenomenon. And if you are married to a non-Jew, and if you are raising children, it is understandable, it is rational why you would begin to downplay the ethnic peoplehood element of Jewishness and emphasize the religious part of the equation. What does I want my children to be Jewish? What does that mean? How do I imbue them with a sense of Jewish identity? I do it through religion. And that has put its stamp on an entire generation. Also, the young people who are children of such interfaith marriages are therefore a new and large and growing segment of the Jewish population. And they are people for whom this idea of all of my ancestors are Jews just it's not true. It doesn't speak to them. So if they do still embrace Jewishness, it's going to be more likely done in a kind of an anti-nationalist vein. And therefore, what I'm suggesting, and sociologists have demonstrated this, but it's still not something that comes up that often in discussions. There is a relationship between the phenomenon of intermarriage, the shift in Jewish identity that resulted, and the growing numbers of young Jews who have no feeling for Israel. All they see is death and destruction, and they respond accordingly. The reason I'm adding this, and as usual, this is not cheery stuff. I unfortunately am not I don't believe I've made people feel better, and I'm certainly not a feel good lecturer. But I do hope and I do believe that deepening our comprehension, sophisticating our understanding of these matters will only help us in the end, so that if you are concerned about the current wave of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist activity, I would urge you to support the ADL in fighting anti-Semitism. When it is anti-Semitic, it is completely not acceptable in civil society, and we have to stand up to that hatred, period, right? But at the same time, there's something else going on underneath it. So that, for example, if a young person no longer feels a sense of the Jewish people and its historical journey and its common destiny, and that basic sense of connection that I called Ahavat Yisrael, if young people don't resonate to all of that, then unfortunately it's on us to educate them. And part of the response has to be that kind of rational approach whereby we are making an argument in good faith with people that have a different point of view, which we acknowledge, which we honor, but we want to recommend a different way of being a Jew. It is yet again, in the modern era, there have been one form of Jewish ideological debate and struggle after another. We're locked in yet another one within our community, Jew versus Jew. And I would not recommend shying away, but rather engaging in that, developing a better understanding of who you are as a Jew, what you believe, what your values are, and advocating those values and promoting them and educating. I hope that speaks to at least some of you. I know that these issues and the place we find ourselves is very tenuous and scary. I have not spoken at any great length about the actual situation in Israel and vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That could easily be another series of lectures. But I do think that the kinds of historical material that we have covered does, I believe, speak to much of what we're all living through. And with that, I will thank you all for your attention, and would love to address questions.
Thank you very, very much. There are already questions that were coming in during your talk, and
really, why am I not surprised?
Comments, thoughts, yeah. So I'll just say the chat is still open. You can keep posting, but I'll start with a few of the historical questions. One is about the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly resolution with the right of return of 1948 that stated that Jews could buy the land from previous occupiers if we didn't want them to return. So there's a question here of why did Jews in Israel not raise the money to satisfy that requirement, and why do we not do that now? I'm actually not sure, because I think many of the lands were bought at the time. So I'm delivering the question as it was. So I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I'm going to have to pass on that. I don't know. I will point out, though, that what is often left out of the discussion is that the colonization project of the Zionist movement was not by any stretch was not a violent process. It was a matter of purchasing land under the Ottomans. What the Zionist movement did was to identify land for purchase. Usually it was un-arable land and low-lying, swampy, marshy areas. You've all heard that the Zionist myth that we turn the swamps into farmland. There's some truth to that, right? Much of the land that was bought was bad land, and therefore the original Jewish settlement outside of the cities. And something else that should be pointed out is the majority. One of the things that divided Jews and Arabs in that early period is that 90% of the Jews were urban in Ottoman Palestine and then in the British Mandate, whereas 70 to 80% of the Palestinian Arabs were rural. So it wasn't just Jew versus Arab, it was also country versus city. It was also an socioeconomic conflict, right? So, that has to be understood. Nevertheless, the lands that were being bought to create new settlements, farming, agricultural settlements in that early period, tended to be along the coastal plain and east to west in the Jezreel Valley in the Galil. Right. So those two lines, if you look at early maps, if you look at both the partition plans of 37 and of 47, the land being offered to the Jews more or less followed where Jews had settled. Right. It was and it's a relative small amount of the overall territory. When Ben Gurion and the Zionist movement declared the establishment of the state of Israel, that was the land they controlled. It was really a very small compared to what later emerges as Israel. So the issue of land purchase is important. It was legal. It was nonviolent. It enabled the early Zionists to feel that they were not being brutal colonizers. The other side of that coin is that very often they were purchasing the land from absentee landlords, Turkish landlords living in Beirut or Damascus, and the tenant farmers who actually lived on the lands were sometimes compensated, but almost always kicked off of the land that they had been living on and farming. So the land purchases weren't completely benign, but relative to the kinds of accusations that are leveled, again, settler colonialism suggests sort of a violent effort to oust. It suggests ethnic cleansing, which can be, a level toward what happens during the War of Independence, but certainly does not apply to the earlier period.
Thank you. So you did actually answer that. So thank you.
Oh, did I? Oh, good. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Many of the questions are about reading materials of various kinds, and I'll get that from you, and I'll send all of that in the follow-up email. There's another question of, is there a possibility of not necessarily anti-Zionism, but actually just non-Zionism and viewing Zionism as something of a project of the past and now referring to the state of Israel as a completely different project?
So yeah, thank you. That's a very good question that I left out. Of course, there's also a kind of there's pro-Zionist, there's anti, and then there's in the middle, non or disinterested, right? So one answer is that it's a spectrum, but the other answer I would give is that it's in Israel in the 80s and 90s that we first see an intellectual trend toward what they call post-Zionism. Okay, the Zionist dream was accomplished, but it created all these other issues. We now need to attend to those issues and without the assumptions of the past. So that's Israeli post-Zionism. My colleague Shaul Magid, many people read and see him as an anti-Zionist. He would dispute that, and he calls himself a counter-Zionist. In other words, he's not dismissing, he's not denying the right to exist. He just wants to see a very different set of circumstances put in place, and that's the nature of any political movement, is that it grows and evolves and changes and develops throughout the course of time, and that's certainly true with Zionism. So one need not be a rabid anti-Zionist to question it and suggest alternatives and to want to improve it, right? That's a charitable reading of people like Shaul Magid. Other people would be less charitable.
So I'm going to consolidate a few questions and try and put them into one because we're running out of time. Regarding this generation of what we're seeing, you mentioned JVP, and if not now, and the statesmen and kind of talking about them with kind of lack of knowledge. So one question, is there any of these anti-Zionist movements that you also identify as not being just from lack of knowledge, but to have some weight? And in that question, there's also what to do in this day and era of TikTok and information becoming into memes and kind of misinformation going around. And I'm going to put into that also the next generation of mixed marriages. How do you see a way, if you do, to kind of bring them back into the fold of a relationship with Israel? So I just smushed like three big questions into one. Take from it what you can.
Oh my goodness. I'll say at least two things. One is I want to expand on that flip comment of mine that it's stupid and ignorant. I mean, I saw a few people smile when I said that. In other words, that makes it that in that moment we feel superior, we feel better, right? I do think that a more reasoned version of that is a criticism I've leveled for a very long time. Too many American Jews, in my view, see Israel from a distance. Both Zionist and anti-Zionist. It's a problem on both sides of that. Too many people see Israel as an abstraction, as an idea. And it's on that abstract idea that they wage battle. If you spend 10 minutes in Israel, as I urge all people to do, you very quickly begin to see that it is a country. It's a reality. It's millions of people. It's thousands of neighborhoods and schools and streets and stories and experiences. It's this whole world that is not subject to the kind of collapsing that tends to be done when people often discuss these issues. So much of the debate, so much of the rhetoric is as if Israel already doesn't exist, but it does. It's a country and it's not going anywhere. So the reality, the concrete reality of Israel has to be something that more people are exposed to. I would say the same thing for the Palestinians. It's an ironic fact, but a fact nonetheless, that there are a little over 7 million Jewish Israelis, and there are approximately 7 million Palestinian Arabs living either in Gaza or the West Bank or in Israel proper altogether. There are 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Israelis. Neither one of them are going anywhere. So that suggests that we are confronted with a challenge, with a dilemma, and it raises the question of what to do, how to solve it, how to approach it. And again, this is a big difference in Israel. I think that whatever an Israeli's political stance is, they're very, very aware of the reality of the situation. Many of them have given up and think there is no solution. But there are many Israelis who continue to fight for some kind of future for all of those people, on the same land. So, I think that is it's a minority. The so-called peace movement. It's not a dominant part of Israeli society, but it's a lot more dominant there, or a lot more present there than it is here. And so that's another example to me of how we Americans tend not to be fully cognizant of what's going on in Israel. How many of us, when we go to visit Israel, take the bus into the West Bank and go see what's going on there? Not too many. We're too busy. We love Israel. We're too busy enjoying this beautiful country that we love. Why complicate matters by going and seeing the underbelly of the so-called occupation, right? I mean, the point is it exists, and I do believe in confronting reality. Something my therapist taught me a long time ago. Not to live in a state of fantasy, but rather let's accept reality. Right? I don't know. Did that answer the question?
I'll say this. We need to end, and I'll say based on the questions, other than needing a much longer course, I think a lot of reading material, and I'll ask you to send it to me so I can share with others. And I think, as you mentioned also before, this topic is way more difficult than the previous two because we're all very emotionally charged, and every word said sparks, I can even see in the chat, every word that said sparks comments. So thank you for
Sherelle, thank you so much for saying that. And it's really hard not to show your own colors and have a political opinion. As a historian, I've tried to do this for the most part. As a historian, we deal in what we want to see as objective facts, and the historical record is not. The more you learn, the more you read on the subject, the more of a sense. And this is similar to what I said about the concrete reality of Israel. The history is a reality as well, and it bears a deep dive, or at the very least, skimming the surface. but it has to be absorbed not through the media, not through the various kinds of propaganda, whether it's from the right or the left, but history is historical study, historical literature, history education attempts to find that rational middle ground. And in that regard, can I put in a word? I mentioned to you earlier, Cheryl, there is a what I think is a very good Israel Studies Institute. It's housed at Brandeis University. It's called the Schusterman Institute for Israel Studies. It was created against the background of the very sharp divide between the anti-Israel and the pro-Israel, and sort of the yelling and screaming that was going on even on college campuses. Forget about the past 6 months for a moment, if you can. But this was established about 15 or so years ago in that context, that we need to create a place to study, research, document, record, and teach about Israel that is engaged with the reality and with the complexity and with ultimately with the greater truth of life there. And I think it's done a fairly good job of creating a field of Israel studies that is relatively objective, relatively non-political. It brings in people from both the right and the left, but it has that center. And I hope that my lectures represented that approach as well.
Thank you very, very much. I also trust our CSP learners to be very acute. They're picking up on every word you're saying, and I can see in the comments pulling it apart. And I think that's beautiful. As a firm believer in non-objectivity, even historians actually show their opinions as they're speaking, and I think that's fine. It's part of, to me, that's precious, and it's part of being able to know that we're involved in this. You started at the get-go, I think, maybe not in this presentation, but that you weren't teaching about Zionism at first because you felt yourself too much involved. So I do thank you for sharing your knowledge with your involvement, because I think that's very worthy and special. So thank you very, very much. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for an amazing series. I believe it showed that we want more. So we'll figure that out. And I'm looking forward to send you all the follow-up email with a lot of reading material.
Cheryl, maybe next time we can do a less controversial issue. What do you think?
I don't know.
Tamar wants controversy. Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I really do thank you for your attention and your good thoughts. Everyone, be well. Stay safe.